My son was walking home from school, doing nothing wrong, thinking only about getting inside and relaxing, when a black SUV suddenly pulled up beside him on our quiet street. Two men stepped out wearing dark vests and fake HOA badges, acting confident and loud as if they had real authority, and one of them told my 16-year-old son that he was under arrest for violating HOA rules. Before my son could even understand what was happening, they grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, and started pushing him toward their vehicle like he was a criminal. I ran outside with my wife right behind me, shouting for them to stop, but the men only smiled and told us to stay back because this was HOA business. What they didn't know was that the woman watching them handcuff her child was not just a scared mother. She was the district attorney, and they had just arrested her son. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from and hit subscribe for more stories where the bad guys always regret their choices. My son was walking home from school that afternoon, following the same quiet street he had taken almost every day since middle school. The sun was low, the air still warm, and nothing felt unusual. His backpack was slung over both shoulders, heavy with books he probably wouldn't even open that night. His mind was on normal teenage things. Food, his phone, maybe a game later if homework didn't take too long. He was doing nothing wrong. He wasn't running. He wasn't loud. He wasn't bothering anyone. He was just trying to get home. He is only 16 years old. Our neighborhood is the kind of place where people feel safe without thinking about it. Clean sidewalks, neatly cut lawns, cars parked the same way every day. People wave but don't talk much. It looks calm, and because of that, people assume nothing bad can happen there. I was inside the house at the time, rinsing a mug at the sink and listening for the sound of the front gate. My wife was in the other room, finishing a phone call for work. Everything felt normal, predictable, safe. That's when a black SUV rolled onto the street. It moved slowly at first, almost crawling, like it was looking for something. The windows were dark, too dark. The engine sound didn't match the calm around it. My son noticed it and stepped slightly closer to the curb, a quiet instinct telling him to keep space. The SUV stopped beside him, not at a driveway, not at the curb, right next to him. Before my son could even ask what was happening, the doors opened and two men stepped out. They moved with confidence, like they expected obedience. They wore dark vests over plain clothes, heavy boots, radios clipped to their shoulders and shiny, badges hanging from their chests. Across their vests were patches that said HOA enforcement in bold letters. Everything about them was designed to look official. One of the men pointed directly at my son. "You," he said loudly, "stop right there." My son froze, confused. The other man stepped closer and said, "You're under arrest for violating HOA rules." Arrest, the word didn't make sense to my son. He had never been in trouble before. He didn't even know what HOA rules were supposed to apply to someone walking home from school. "For what?" my son asked. They didn't answer him. Instead, one of the men grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back without warning. The movement was fast and rough. My son cried out in pain as his backpack slid off his shoulders and hit the pavement. The sound was loud enough to echo down the street. That sound reached the house. I heard it through the open window and felt something drop in my chest. I didn't know what had happened yet, but I knew something was wrong. I rushed to the front door, and my wife came out of the hallway behind me, her phone still in her hand. When we stepped outside, the scene stopped us cold. Our son was being pushed toward the black SUV, his arm bent behind him, his face pale and tight with fear. One man held him firmly while the other opened the back door of the vehicle like this was routine. "Hey," I shouted, "what do you think you're doing?" The men didn't even look at me at first. "This is HOA business," one of them said calmly, like that explained everything. My wife stepped forward beside me. Her voice was steady, controlled, the same voice she used in courtrooms every day. "Release him," she said. Now, the man holding our son finally turned and smiled. "You should stay back," he said. "You don't want to make this worse." Neighbors had started coming outside. Some stood on their porches, some gathered at the edge of their driveways. Phones appeared quietly in hands. No one knew what to do. The men seemed to feed off that silence. They pushed my son closer to the SUV and told him not to resist, even though he wasn't resisting at all. He kept saying he didn't understand. He kept looking at us, his eyes wide, asking without words if this was really happening. My wife asked them again what rule he had broken. She asked under what authority they were detaining a minor. They ignored her questions completely. "This does not concern you," one of them said. "HOA enforcement has full authority here." That sentence changed everything. He said it like it was absolute truth, like no one could challenge it, like the badge on his chest placed him above the people standing there. My wife took one more step forward. "You are illegally detaining my son," she said clearly. The man laughed. "Lady," he said, "you don't get to give orders." The confidence in his voice was real. He truly believed no one would stop him. He believed the uniform would protect him. He believed fear would keep everyone in place. My wife reached into her purse slowly. The men noticed the movement but didn't stop her. She pulled out her badge and held it up where everyone could see. "I am the district attorney of this county," she said calmly, "and you are committing a felony in front of witnesses." The street went silent. One of the men stiffened. The other took a step back without realizing it. Their confidence cracked. "You will remove your hands from my son," my wife continued, "or every charge that applies will be filed before tonight ends." They hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Sirens could already be heard in the distance. Someone had called the police, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone watching online. The men finally let go of my son and stepped away. Their faces pale now, their movements unsure. My son ran to us shaking. When the police arrived, everything changed. Real officers, real badges, real authority. Witnesses spoke. Videos were shown. The fake HOA gear was examined. The men were handcuffed and placed in the back of a real police car. This time they didn't smile. They had tried to hide behind fake power. They had tried to control a child, and they had arrested the district attorney's son. The men moved fast, like they had done this many times before. There was no hesitation in the way they handled my son, no sign of doubt or uncertainty. One of them reached the black SUV and pulled the rear door open, while the other tightened his grip on my son's arm, forcing him forward, his hand pressed down hard on my son's shoulder, pushing his upper body toward the vehicle as if he were dealing with a grown criminal instead of a frightened 16-year-old boy. "Don't resist," the man said sharply. My son wasn't resisting at all. He kept saying the same thing over and over, his voice shaking as fear crept in. He said he didn't understand what he had done wrong. He said he was just walking home from school. His words came out fast and confused, but the men didn't respond. They didn't even acknowledge that he was speaking. To them, he was no longer a kid with questions. He was a problem they believed they had the right to control. I stepped closer, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "You need to tell us what rule he broke," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You can't just take a child like this." One of the men finally turned his head and looked at me. His expression was flat, almost bored, like he had already decided that nothing I said mattered. "This doesn't concern you," he said. "OA enforcement has full authority here." "Full authority," he said it with confidence, as if it were written into law somewhere, that he could grab whoever he wanted and face no consequences. In that moment, I realized something that scared me more than their actions. They truly believed their own lie. They weren't bluffing. They weren't pretending. They had convinced themselves that the badge on their chest gave them real power. My wife stepped forward then. She didn't rush. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She moved calmly, placing herself in clear view of both men, and spoke in a controlled, professional tone that immediately stood out against their aggression. "Please explain the charge," she said, "and explain why you are detaining a minor without law enforcement present." The men ignored her. One of them adjusted his grip on my son's arm, twisting it slightly higher behind his back. My son winced and sucked in a sharp breath, trying not to cry. I could see his fingers shaking, his body tense as he tried to stay upright. "Get in the car," the man said again. My wife took another step forward. "You do not have the authority to arrest anyone," she said, "especially not a child." The man laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't nervous. It was confident. "Lady," he said, "you really should stop talking." That laugh told me everything. They weren't worried. They weren't scared. They believed they were untouchable. Neighbors had started to gather by now. A few people stood at the edges of their driveways, pretending to check their phones while watching everything unfold. Others stood on their porches, arms crossed, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. Several phones were pointed toward the street, quietly recording. No one spoke. That silence gave the men courage. One of them pushed my son forward again, forcing him closer to the open SUV door. My son stumbled slightly, catching himself just before falling. He looked back at us, his eyes wide, his face pale. He wasn't crying anymore. He was past that stage. He was scared in a deeper way now. "Please," he said softly, "I didn't do anything." The man holding him leaned closer and spoke in a low voice meant only for him. "Then you should have followed the rules," he said. "Rules." The word felt empty. My wife spoke again, her voice sharper now, not angry but precise. "Remove your hands from my son," she said. The man finally turned fully toward her. "You don't get to give orders here," he replied. "This is HOA business." That sentence hung in the air. HOA business. They were using those words like a shield, hiding behind them as if they erased the law, erased common sense, erased basic human decency. They believed that as long as they said it confidently enough, no one would challenge them. For a moment, it almost worked. Even I felt the weight of the situation pressing down, the fear that pushing harder might make things worse. That was the trap they relied on. Fear, confusion, silence. But my wife didn't step back. She reached into her purse slowly, deliberately, making sure every movement was calm and visible. The men noticed but didn't stop her. Still convinced they were in control, she pulled out her badge. She didn't wave it. She didn't raise it high. She simply held it where they could see it clearly. "I am the district attorney of this county," she said, "and you are illegally detaining my son." The effect was immediate. One of the men stiffened, his shoulders tightening. The other took a small step back, his eyes fixed on the badge. The confidence drained from their faces in real time. "You are committing multiple felonies," my wife continued calmly, "and every second you keep your hands on him adds another charge." The man holding my son loosened his grip slightly, his fingers no longer digging into my son's arm. "Let's just calm down," he said, his voice no longer as firm as before. "We can talk about this." "No," my wife replied. "You will release him now." They hesitated. That hesitation cost them everything. In the distance, sirens began to sound. Faint at first, then closer. Someone had called the police. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe someone watching from their phone. It didn't matter. The men looked at each other, panic starting to show. They released my son and stepped back as the first police cruiser turned onto the street. Real officers stepped out, real badges, real authority. The lie collapsed instantly. Witnesses spoke. Videos were shown. My son's red wrist and shaking hands told the rest of the story. Within minutes, the men who claimed full authority were face down on the pavement, handcuffed for real this time. They had believed the badge gave them power. They had believed no one would challenge them. They were wrong. My wife asked one simple question. She didn't shout it. She didn't rush it. She stood still, looking directly at the two men, and asked in a calm, clear voice that carried across the quiet street, "Who gave you the authority to arrest a minor?" For the first time since they arrived, the men hesitated. It was small, just a second, but it was there. The taller one shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The other tightened his grip on my son's arm, not because it was necessary, but because he felt something slipping and didn't know how to stop it. That pause told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't expected questions. They were used to commands being obeyed, to people freezing, to parents panicking and backing down. They relied on confusion and fear to keep control. A calm question broke that pattern. The taller man laughed, a short, forced sound that came too fast. "We're allowed to detain anyone violating HOA rules," he said. "We hold them until police arrive." He said it confidently, like he had rehearsed it before. But his eyes told a different story. They didn't stay steady. They flicked from my wife's face to the phones now pointed at him, then back again. He swallowed hard before finishing his sentence, and that small movement didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors had gathered more closely now. What started as people watching from porches had turned into a loose crowd along the sidewalk and driveways. Some stood with arms crossed, others whispered to each other. Almost all of them had their phones out, recording silently. The men noticed. The street no longer felt empty. It felt crowded. My son stood between the two men, his arms still twisted behind his back, his shoulders tight with pain. His face was pale, his jaw clenched as he tried not to show how much it hurt. Every few seconds, his fingers twitched, and I could see him fighting the urge to pull away. My wife looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the men. "You might want to remove those cuffs right now," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't threatening. It was final. The taller man scoffed. "We're not removing anything," he said. "You don't get to tell us how to do our job." The shorter one nodded quickly, like he needed the support. "This kid's resisting," he added. Even though my son hadn't moved at all, that lie landed badly. A murmur went through the crowd. Someone said, "He's not resisting." Another voice added, "That's a kid." The men heard it. Their posture changed. The taller one straightened his back, raising his chin, trying to reclaim the authority he felt slipping away. He stepped closer to my wife, invading her space slightly, a move meant to intimidate. "Step back," he told her. "This is your last warning." My wife didn't move. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him and said, "You are making this worse. For yourself." The shorter man tightened the cuffs, not by accident, not by reflex, on purpose. My son gasped as the metal bit into his wrists, his shoulders jerking slightly in pain. He cried out, a sharp sound that cut through the street. That was the moment something snapped. I took a step forward before I even realized it. My hands clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. The crowd reacted instantly. A few people shouted. Someone yelled for them to stop. "Hey, that's enough," a neighbor called out. The men ignored them. The taller one smiled again, but this time it wasn't confident. It was tight. "Defensive, you see?" he said loudly. "This is what happens when people interfere." That smile was their biggest mistake, because it told everyone watching exactly who they were. My wife looked at my son again, then back at the men. Her expression changed, not to anger, not to panic, but to something colder, something more focused. She reached slowly into her purse. The movement caught the men's attention immediately. "Hey," the taller one said sharply, "don't reach for anything." My wife stopped, her hand still inside the purse. "I'm getting my identification," she said calmly. The men exchanged a quick glance. They didn't like that. They didn't know what to expect, and uncertainty made them nervous. "Do it slow," the shorter one said. She did. She pulled her hand out slowly and held what she was carrying at chest level. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. It was a badge, plain and official, catching the light as she turned it slightly so everyone could see. "I am the district attorney of this county," she said, "and you are unlawfully restraining my son." The effect was immediate. The taller man's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He stared at the badge longer than he should have. The shorter man's grip loosened just enough that my son felt it. The crowd react. Ed, too. Whispers spread fast. "Did she say district attorney? That's the DA? Oh, they're done." The men heard it all. "This doesn't change anything," the taller one said quickly, but his voice wasn't steady anymore. "HOA authority still applies." My wife shook her head. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She took a step closer, careful, controlled. "You have no authority to arrest anyone," she continued. "You have no authority to detain a minor, and you have no authority to use restraints." She paused. "And every camera pointed at you right now is recording evidence." The shorter man swallowed hard. Sirens sounded faintly in the distance, not loud yet, but close enough. The men looked at each other again, panic starting to creep in where confidence used to be. They had gone too far. They knew it now. The lie they had been hiding behind was cracking, and there was no way to patch it. "You should take those cuffs off," my wife said again. "Right now." The taller man hesitated. That hesitation was the crack, the first real one, because power that relies on fear collapses the moment fear stops working, and it had stopped working. My wife pulled out her badge. She didn't do it fast. She didn't do it to shock anyone. There was no sudden movement, no dramatic gesture, no raised voice meant to draw attention. She moved slowly, carefully, the way someone does when they knows every eye is already watching. Her hand went into her purse, paused for a moment, then came back out holding a small leather case. The men noticed immediately. Everything about their posture changed. Up until that moment, they had been loud and confident, speaking over people, using big words like authority and enforcement, as if saying them enough times made them real. Now they went quiet. Their shoulders stiffened. Their eyes followed her hand closely, unsure of what was coming next. My wife opened the case and held it up at chest level, not high, not low, just enough for everyone to see. "I am the district attorney for this county," she said clearly, "and you are illegally detaining my son." The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They landed heavy. The street went silent, not the normal quiet of a calm neighborhood, but the kind of silence that feels thick, like the air itself is holding its breath. Even the small background sounds, the wind in the trees, a car far away, someone's phone buzzing, seemed to fade. One of the men took a step back without meaning to. It was small, just half a step, but everyone saw it. The other man didn't move at all. He stood frozen, staring at the badge as if it might disappear if he looked long enough. The color slowly drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He swallowed hard. The grip on my son's arm loosened. Just a little. My son felt it immediately. His shoulders dropped a fraction, not because he felt safe yet, but because the pressure had changed. Something had shifted. "This conversation is over," my wife continued. Her voice stayed calm, steady, controlled. "You will release my son right now, or every charge you can imagine will be filed against you by tonight." She didn't rush the sentence. She didn't threaten. She stated facts. The men looked at each other. They didn't smile anymore. They didn't laugh. The confidence that had carried them through the last several minutes was gone, replaced by confusion and fear. They were trying to understand what had just happened, how the situation had slipped out of their control so fast. This doesn't change anything," the taller one said finally, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. "Oh, enforcement still—" "No," my wife said, cutting him off gently. "It changes everything." She took a small step closer, careful not to invade their space, but close enough that there was no doubt she was in control now. "You have no legal authority to arrest anyone," she said. "You have no authority to detain a minor, and you have no authority to use restraints. What you are doing is not enforcement. It is a crime." The shorter man's hand was shaking. He tried to hide it by adjusting his grip on the cuffs, but that only made it worse. The metal rattled softly, a sound that suddenly seemed very loud in the silence. Around us, neighbors were no longer whispering. They were talking openly now. "Did she say district attorney? Oh, they messed up. This is illegal, all of it." Phones were raised higher, angles adjusted. The men noticed the cameras pointed at them from every direction. They had used fear to control people before, but fear was gone now. In its place was something worse for them, attention. "You need to remove the handcuffs," my wife said again. "Right now." The taller man hesitated. That hesitation stretched longer than it should have. In that moment, I could see the calculation happening in his head. He was weighing his options, trying to decide if the was any way out that didn't end with him in serious trouble. But every second he waited only made things worse. Sirens could be heard more clearly now. Not loud yet, but close, very close. "Let's just calm down," the taller man said, his voice suddenly softer. "We can talk this through." My wife shook her head. "No," she said. "You had your chance to talk. You chose force instead." She pointed gently at my son's wrists. "Remove them," she said. The shorter man looked at the taller one, panic written across his face. The taller man didn't answer. He just stared at the badge again, like it might give him a different answer this time. Finally, the shorter man reached down. His hands were shaking badly now. The handcuffs came off. They didn't come off smoothly. He fumbled with the key, dropping it once, then picking it up again with clumsy fingers. The metal clicked open, and he pulled the cuffs away from my son's wrists like they were burning him. My son stepped back immediately. He came straight to us, his breathing fast, his hands red and marked where the cuffs had been. My wife put an arm around him, pulling him close. I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension still running through him. The men stepped back together, not because they were told to, but because instinct told them to create distance. They were no longer in control. They knew it. Everyone knew it. The taller man wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His vest no longer looked official. It looked cheap, fake, like a costume that had been exposed. "This is a misunderstanding," he said weakly. My wife looked at him for a long moment before responding. "No," she said. "It's not." The first police cruiser turned onto the street. Red and blue lights washed over the houses, the cars, the faces of everyone watching. The sound of the siren cut through the tension like a knife. Another cruiser arrived, and another. Real officers stepped out, real uniforms, real badges. The contrast was impossible to miss. The fake authority vanished completely. The officers listened as people spoke over each other, eager to explain what they had seen. Videos were shown, statements were given. One officer looked at my son's wrists, then at the men standing awkwardly near the SUV. Another officer approached my wife. His posture changed when she showed her badge again. "Yes, ma'am," he said respectfully. The men were separated. Questions were asked. Their answers didn't line up. They were handcuffed again, this time for real. As they were led toward the police car, the taller man glanced back at us one last time. There was no anger in his eyes now, no arrogance, only regret. The street slowly began to breathe again. Neighbors lowered their phones. Some shook their heads. Others whispered about how close it had come to being much worse. My son stayed close to us, still shaken, but safe. And the men who thought fake power made them untouchable finally understood the truth. Real authority doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, it ends things quietly and permanently. The sound of sirens grew louder with every passing second. At first it was distant, barely noticeable under the tension hanging in the air. Then it became clear, sharp, real, the kind of sound that changes everything once you hear it because it means the situation is no longer controlled by lies or fake authority. Police cars arrived minutes later. Not one, not two. 3 cruisers turned onto the street, lights flashing red and blue, washing over the houses, the parked cars, the faces of the neighbors who were still standing frozen in place. The sound of the sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood like a warning that something serious had happened here. Real officers stepped out, real uniforms, real badges, real presence. The difference was obvious immediately. The 2 HOA men stiffened the moment they saw the cruisers. Their shoulders pulled back, their hands moved away from their vests, and the confidence they had worn like armor finally disappeared. They no longer looked in control. They looked small, exposed. One officer approached first, his hand resting calmly near his belt, his eyes scanning the scene without rushing. He looked at my son standing between us, his wrists red and slightly swollen, then at the black SUV parked at an angle in the street. "What's going on here?" the officer asked. Before anyone else could answer, one of the HOA men stepped forward quickly, talking fast, his words tumbling over each other. "Officer, this is an HOA enforcement matter," he said. "We were detaining him for violating community rules. Everything was under control." Until the officer raised his hand. "Stop," he said calmly. The word wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The officer turned and looked around at the crowd of neighbors, many of whom were holding up their phones. He nodded slightly, already understanding that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Another officer approached us. He looked directly at my son. "Are you okay?" he asked. My son shook his head slightly and held up his wrists. The red marks stood out clearly against his skin, and one of them was already starting to bruise. The officer's jaw tightened as he looked closer. "You want to tell me what happened?" he asked gently. My son explained in a quiet voice how he had been walking home, how the SUV stopped beside him, how the men grabbed him and put cuffs on him without explaining why. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't add anything. He just told the truth. As he spoke, neighbors began to step forward one by one. "I saw everything," one woman said. "They grabbed him for no reason," another added. "That kid didn't do anything wrong," someone else said. Phones were handed to the officers. Videos were played. Angles showed my son being grabbed. The cuffs going on, the men pushing him toward the SUV. The story became impossible to deny. The officers turned their attention to the HOA men. One officer walked slowly around the black SUV, looking inside through the windows. He pointed at the radios, the fake paperwork stacked on the seat, the plastic badges clipped to the vests. "These yours?" he asked. The HOA man nodded weakly. "What department?" the officer asked. There was a pause. "HOA enforcement," the man said again, quieter this time. The officer looked at him. Then he looked at the badge. Then he laughed, not a friendly laugh. A short, sharp sound filled with disbelief. "HOA doesn't arrest people," he said. "Especially not kids," the man tried to explain. "We're allowed to detain—" "No," the officer interrupted. "You're not." Another officer joined them, holding a phone that had just been handed to him by a neighbor. "This video shows you applying restraints," the officer said, "without consent, without cause." The HOA men stopped talking. They knew the words were useless now. One of the officers finally turned toward my wife. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "may I see your identification?" My wife nodded and handed over her badge. The officer's posture changed instantly. His shoulders straightened. His tone softened. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I didn't realize who you were." She nodded once, That's fine, she replied. I just want this handled correctly. It will be, the officer said firmly. The officers stepped away for a brief moment, speaking quietly among themselves. They looked at the evidence, the videos, the marks on my son's wrists, the fake uniforms, the SUV. Then they came back. All right, one officer said. Turn around, hands behind your ba. The HOA men froze. What? One of them said. You're being detained, the officer said. For unlawful restraint, impersonation, and assault. The handcuffs came out. This time there was no hesitation. Metal clicked shut around their wrists, tight and real. The men winced as they were turned around and guided toward the police car. The same men who had dragged my son toward their SUV now stumbled as they were led away. Neighbors watched silently. No one cheered. No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was heavier than that. The officers searched the SUV next. They pulled out fake citation books, printed HOA arrest forms, radios set to private channels, and lists of addresses. The officers exchanged looks as they examined the items. These guys have been doing this for a while. One officer said quietly, My wife heard it. Her expression hardened. The officers returned to us. Your son is free to go, one officer said. We'll need statements later, but he's not in any trouble. My son nodded, still quiet, still processing everything. I put my arm around him. You're safe, I said. He nodded again, finally breathing a little easier. As the HOA men were placed into the back of the police cruiser, one of them looked over his shoulder at us. There was no anger in his eyes now, no pride, only fear. The doors closed. The cruisers pulled away slowly, lights still flashing, leaving the street strangely quiet again. Neighbors began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others whispering about how close it had come to something worse. My son stayed close to us as we walked back toward the house. The sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the street. Everything looked normal again, but nothing felt the same because fake authority had been exposed and real law had finally arrived. That night, the house felt different, not broken, not unsafe, juice, tea quiet in a way it hadn't been before. My son sat at the kitchen table with his backpack still on the floor where he had dropped it when we came inside. He hadn't moved it. He hadn't opened it. He just sat there, staring at the wood grain of the table, his hands resting in front of him. He was still shaking a little, not enough to notice if you didn't know him. But I did. I could see it in the way his fingers tapped lightly against the table, the way his shoulders stayed tense, like he was waiting for something else to happen. He was safe, but the fear hadn't left him yet. My wife set a glass of water in front of him and sat down across from him. She didn't rush him. She didn't ask questions. She just stayed there, present, letting him breathe and come back to himself in his own time. I stood by the counter for a moment, watching them, replaying everything that had happened over and over in my head. The grab, the cuffs, the look on his face when he realized strangers could hurt him and claim it was authority. That part hurt the most, not the fear, the betrayal. Eventually, my son looked up. Am I in trouble? He asked quietly. My wife answered immediately. No, she said. You did nothing wrong, not one thing. He nodded, but I could tell he needed to hear it more than once. You didn't break any rules, I added. And even if you had, no one gets to touch you like that. He took a slow breath. That was the first real breath I had seen him take all evening. After a while, my wife stood up and picked up her phone. I need to make a few calls, she said gently. She didn't say more than that. She didn't have to. I knew what those calls meant. She stepped into the other room, closed the door quietly, and began doing what she had spent her career doing, making sure the law worked the way it was supposed to, not loud, not emotional, precise. I stayed with my son. We talk. About small things, school, his friends, a show he liked, nothing heavy, nothing about the street or the SUV or the men, just normal things to remind him that normal still existed. An hour passed, then two, when my wife came back into the kitchen. Her face looked tired but calm. It's done, she said. I asked what that meant. She sat down and explained it slowly. By morning, the so-called HOA enforcement group would be finished. Their fake licenses were already suspended. Their equipment had been seized. Charges were being prepared, real charges, not threats. Impersonation, assault, unlawful restraint, abuse of authority, each one backed by witness statements and video evidence. They won't be doing this to anyone else, she said. My son looked up at her. Ever? He asked. She shook her head. No, she said. Ever. That night, I walked him upstairs and stayed until he fell asleep. He asked me to leave the door open, something he hadn't done since he was little. I didn't comment on it. I left it open. The neighborhood was quiet when I stepped outside later that night. Streetlights glowed softly. Lawns looked the same as they always had. If someone had driven through without knowing what happened, they never would have guessed anything had gone wrong, but things had changed. By morning, the news spread fast. Neighbors talked. Messages were shared. Videos circulated. People learned that the HOA enforcement group wasn't real, that they had been stopping residents, threatening them, taking advantage of fear and confusion. Stories came out, one after another. A woman said they had scared her teenage daughter. A man said they had demanded money. Another family said they had been followed. All of it stopped now. The HOA board released a statement trying to distance themselves. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The truth was out. By the end of the day, the office the men used was closed. Signs were taken down. Phones were disconnected. Their names were public. Their power was gone. The street went quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was a better one, a safer one. My son went back to school the next week. He walked the same street again, not because he forgot what happened, but because he refused to let it own him. The first day was hard. The second was easier. By the end of the week, the tension in his shoulders had softened. He still noticed cars, still paid attention, but the fear no longer controlled him. One evening, he looked at me and said, "They thought they could do whatever they wanted." I nodded. "Why?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because fake power only works when people are scared," I said. "The moment someone stands up, it falls apart." He nodded slowly. That night, as I turned off the lights downstairs, I thought about the men who had stood on our street with fake badges and loud voices, convinced they were untouchable. They weren't evil masterminds. They were worse. They were small people hiding behind symbols, hoping no one would question them. They learned something they would never forget. Fake power only works until it meets real authority, and they chose the wrong family to test it on.